I am Diana Richards, and this is not a pipe podcast.
Hey, as you probably saw here, this is not a typical Not a Pipe podcast, and I'm very happy to be joined by Diana. We thought we'd do a little bonus video / podcast and talk a little bit about my new book, Batman and the Joker, Contested Sexuality in Popular Culture, and I think we'll have a fun conversation.
Yeah. This is we have a story, Chris and I.
We do have a story.
We have a story, and we got history. So, where to start? I guess, when I retired in 2017, I moved to North Carolina, not very far from where Chris lives and teaches. No, I have to go back to the beginning. The beginning actually is probably 1963, when I first...
It's a 1 hour podcast.
When I first started buying comic books. I read comic books before I could read them. I bought them as soon as I could scrounge together 12 cents, because that's what they cost. Over time, over the years, I amassed a collection of some 7,000 or 8,000 books. It had always been my goal to donate these comics to a small liberal arts college, not a big university, but a small liberal arts college for the purposes of research. Call it kryptonite, call it a radioactive spider bite, call it a magical ring from somebody in a spaceship. It just so happened that the person who was installing the internet in my office at my home looked around at my office. I had some Batman's things and so forth. He said, "My son would love this." I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yes, he goes to school at Young Harris College. And they actually teach comic books, and there's a guy there that is all about comic books." I said, "Well, that's great." So the young man and a couple of friends came up and looked at the collection. We had a wonderful time. And then Chris came up, and that's where we met. Long story, try to make this story as short as possible. I ended up donating my collection to Young Harris College, and Chris is the curator of the collection. And I just visited yesterday, and they have done a wonderful job of cataloging it. The security is good on it. Everything is there. They're just waiting for people to research. So there it is. But that's the beginning of the story, Chris. I'll let Chris.
Well, yeah, and thank you. And so as we were talking, we realized that there is a cool story and a lot of really cool connections that, no pressure. You don't have to interview me with prepared Diane Sawyer stuff or anything, but we thought we would just share our conversation and tease out some of those connections. So my book, just as a quick summary for people who haven't seen it yet, it's about Batman and it's about the Joker and their relationship, but more so in a larger scheme, it's about pop culture and the way that we enact gender and sexuality, the way that we perform it, the way that even someone who is a quote unquote typical guy, like maybe Bruce Wayne, is still very much conscious of his performance. And that's what I try to tease out, looking from 1939 to now, Batman and the Joker, who is, often represented to contrast Bruce Wayne or Batman. So if Batman does something, the Joker will do it in a more overtly homosexual or queer or strange way that makes Batman seem a little bit more normal. And that's what I tease out as well, is what is normal and why do we assume these things? And, there's been a link for a long time, as people who study this know, between homosexuality or queer representation and criminality. So bad guys are often gay guys in older Hollywood, older pop culture. That's changed a lot, but when the Joker was created, he was very much created as a queer villain, and he still is today, but I'd say in a much more empowering, to a certain extent, empowering way as in terms of representation. And so, we had no idea of all the connections between us. I mean, we knew that we both loved comics, and we knew that we both were in proximity to each other, and we'd had some good conversations. We'd actually presented at Dragon Con, and after looking at all the comics in the collection, I started really working, and that's one of the reasons, and thank you again, it's one of the reasons this book got made. But there's more to it than that.
Here's where the story gets interesting. along about the time probably that Chris was finishing up the book, and it was going through the drafts and going back and forth editing and all that, the first part of this year. Along about that time, I had, if you haven't determined already, I am a trans woman. And if you know anybody who's transgender, all their life, they want to live in their preferred gender. I was fortunate that I could make that decision in January this year. So in January this year, I began living as Diana full time, probably about the time that Chris was finishing the book. Sometime in August, I think it probably was, I sent an email to Chris and said, here's what's happening. You know, you're a friend. I think you should know. Of course, Chris is, wow. But he also mentioned that he was writing this book and directed me to the YouTube video that I hope you all have looked at, talking about the book. The video, eye-opener, awestruck, flabbergasted, pick your word, because so many of the themes in the book speak to the transgendered experience in almost a one-for-one fashion. The one thing that, and there's a lot of these that we talk about, but I think the one thing that really hit me the most was when Chris talked about the performative nature of the superhero. Bruce Wayne is performing as Bruce Wayne, and it's not a fake. It's it's his true self. Batman, but then he performs as Batman. Clark Kent, Superman. Peter Parker, Spider-Man. Hal Jordan, Green Lantern. All of them perform, and perform is not a fake. It's not pejorative. It's the performance. And I realized, oh my goodness. Before my transition, I performed. I was a husband, father, and all the rest of it. Now I'm performing, and I hate, in the sense that these are true selves. That was so powerful to me that when I started thinking about it, there are so many confluences, congruences between the superhero and the transgender experience.
Yeah, I was really happy. I mean, obviously, I was so happy for you. I think one of the things that made me, really impressed by that connection in terms of, sussing out what does that mean to think about trans people, maybe even more broadly, the queer community or communities, the different communities. And when you were talking about how walking outside and feeling comfortable was like walking outside as Spider-Man the first time he puts on his outfit, or Batman once he really does get that outfit right. But yeah, maybe you could tell me a little bit about that.
There are so many tropes in superhero world that what's interesting about this is that from 5 years old, I was reading comic books. From 5 years old, I knew I was transgender. But until Chris's book came out and he started talking about the themes in the book, all these years, I had never made this connection so strongly between the two. So just in that, the book has been a revelation. Everybody read the book. But for example, there's always the very famous scene, even for those who don't read comic books, in the Spider-Man movie, very famous scene, he discovers his powers and he goes swinging down the canyons of New York City, shouting at the top of his lungs, because look what I can do. The first time I went out in public and was more or less accepted, it's like, look what I can do. So yeah, that's one, I think, trope.
Yeah, and just seeing your face when you say that, it makes me happy. Like, it's something, one of the things I hope to do in the book is talk about how we're all doing this. So even if I don't identify as trans, I'm still putting on a performance of my gender and sexuality. And I hope it's not a scary thing. I know it is a scary thing for people to admit that sometimes, right? Because we're trained that this is natural. You are natural, and if you deviate from this, you're unnatural. But the whole idea of fake or real kind of falls apart once we start thinking about performance, right? And if we're all performing, there's not a real performance and a fake performance. It's all performance, and yeah. So yeah, it was just all these connections were amazing to find.
Yeah, there's a long passage in the book that I've highlighted that speaks to this whole issue of learning to be like Bruce Wayne learns to be Bruce Wayne, and then he learns to be Batman. I think another really critical issue kind of connected to this is that at what point does one true self become the other true self? For 65 years, I was a true self, and now I am a true self. Neither one was the fake. And it's the costume. I think this whole issue with the costume is so important in superhero. With the superhero, it went for pages and pages, a discussion of the changes in Superman's S-shield, just the shield, over the years. Whenever the movie comes out, the first thing on the internet is, what's the costume look like? Is the costume cool or is it stupid? How do they deal with the costume? The costume is so critical. And Bruce Wayne he's the greatest martial artist in the world. Bruce Wayne can knock down a tree with one kick. Bruce Wayne can figure out crimes, but he's not Batman. Clark Kent can shoot heat rays from his eyes. He can fly at the speed of light and all the rest of it, but he's not Superman until he puts on the suit. It is the suit, it's the costume that allows the Batman-ness, if you will, of Bruce Wayne. In the transgender world, the connection should be obvious. I am Diana when I am wearing Diana's clothes. That's not all of it, of course. Batman, there have been storylines where Superman or Batman put on the costume, but they still act like Bruce Wayne or Clark Kent, and everybody sees through it. So the costume is critical, but it's not all of it. I have no trouble, and forgive me for going on, but I just want to make this point. I never had any problem believing that a pair of glasses was all Clark Kent needed, or Superman needed to become Clark Kent, because it's about this performance that the suit, the clothes, engender, I guess. No pun intended.
Yeah, and honestly, before you told me that, I didn't agree. I didn't find it believable because I wasn't thinking of it in that way. And I'm talking about, growing up looking at Superman or Batman. I would have said that's bullshit if a guy puts on glasses and nobody can tell. But I absolutely see it now that it's not the glasses, it's the performance, right? It's the way he moves. You were saying you liked Christopher Reeve's rendition.
I think he did the best job of the dichotomy. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's so much more. The glasses are one thing. The bat symbol is one thing, but if it's not Batman underneath, right? Because of all this other stuff. And the thing I'm not trying to say, just for the record here, in the book that, Batman is actually secretly gay or he's a drag queen or something like that. But I think if we think about what it means to be queer as an umbrella term, and maybe we could talk about that because you were saying, well, we'll talk about that. But yeah, if you think about what queer theory does in terms of allowing us to think about what's normal, what should be normal, or why do people think certain things should be normal? Batman helps highlight that. I mean, so if you think you're a straight guy, you're watching or reading Batman, you're performing. If you don't think you're a straight guy or a woman or whatever, you're performing too. And it's not that only certain groups are performing. And I think it's both empowering, but also I think particularly for men who are reading these comics who think that they are normal straight men, that's maybe scary to think that, no, actually that's a performance too. But I mean, I try to make the case that it is.
Something just occurs to me from what you just said. like I said, the comics growing up were, I feel, were a major part of building my character. But I realize now they were a major part of building my male character. Honesty and integrity. Not that those are should be male only traits, but a man at his best should be certain things. And I think that's what the comics were teaching me, because I had to learn it. Now this is okay. I'm making this up as I go along right now, because this never occurred to me like this. And maybe that's why I never made the direct connection, like I mentioned earlier, because I was focusing on what's the word, heteronormative?
Yeah, heteronormative,
aspect of it. Learning from the comics how to be a man and how to pass as a man. That just occurred to me. Yeah. Thank you again for another blinding light.
No, I mean, that's the thing, is we can all, I think, learn about our own experiences. Even though we've already had those experiences, we can think about them a little bit differently. Because me too. Like, so we both learned how to perform what it means to be a man and perform what it means to be a woman, and anything that we do, that we embody, comes from, other things. And this is not me obviously inventing this. There's so much great literature out there. Judith Butler, Eve Sedgwick, all these people who have written and whom I try to quote in that book, talk about how it's not like there's this real you underneath and then you're faking it if you do something different. It's no, the whatever you're performing. And I think we should embrace that, whether we're trans or not, whether we're gay or not, or however we want to identify, we're all performing, and we might as well have fun with it. And I think, to me, that's what Batman has taught me when looking at it from a queer theory lens. Yeah,
this whole thing, there's another aspect, where the streams come together with the transgender world and the superhero tropes. In terms of performance, that's the secret identity. Up until, 20 years ago, I suppose, all superheroes had a secret identity. It was just, you're a superhero, you have a secret identity. Fantastic Four was the first ones that I think broke that. But why does the superhero need a secret identity? For two reasons. First of all, so he can get some rest, and to protect his family, or to protect his loved ones. Uncle Ben, Aunt May, Lois Lane, all the rest of them. The secret identity is to protect the family, to protect the loved ones. I am so fortunate that I have been able to live full time, but that has meant that I have had to give up my secret identity that I had for all those years. Like, I don't know the percentages. Most transgender people, you don't tell anybody. You tell a very select few, but you don't tell. Maybe you tell your family, maybe not, but you tell very, very few people, because you have to have that secret identity, just as Superman had to, Bruce Wayne has to, in order to survive, in order to live. So the whole thing in one identity, secret identity, we're performing in a very real way. But in the other, of course, it begs the question, which is the secret identity? In another way, we're performing in the other identity, but it's just another congruence that struck me between the superheroes and the transgender world.
Yeah, and one thing I realized too, as you say that, is that you were concerned about, how society might judge you, and I think more so your family, and how that might affect your family if you wanted to come out as Diana decades earlier. The person who doesn't care about that is the Joker. And so the Joker effectively comes out all the time and has been from the beginning.
Keep going with that. I love this. Go, keep going with that.
Well, but he is the bad guy. And so he clearly doesn't care about whatever loved ones or what have you. And so in a sense, he's free to do whatever queer act, deemed by society that's wrong or deviant. he doesn't care, and so he does that, whereas Bruce Wayne does care. And again, I'm not saying that Bruce Wayne is hiding a sort of inner homosexuality or what have you, but he very much does care, Bruce Wayne, about how society sees him and his loved ones, and therefore puts on a very conscious performance. Whereas that's not to say, of course, that the Joker isn't performing, but the Joker can go in and out like a trickster.
Let me just interrupt for a second. Including, there have been storylines where Joker has threatened to reveal Batman's secret identity, whether he actually knew it or not.
Yeah.
I think there was a storyline where he knew it, but then forgot. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And so, but that's what we've been learning from. It's obviously, I use Batman as an example, not as the only or as the source of all of these ideas that kind of circulate in society. But the Joker demonstrates that if you do come out, no hesitation, especially 1939 when it started, or 1940 when the Joker, appears and keeps coming back as a great villain. He doesn't care about those sort of social standards, whether that means criminality or queer representation, which are, one and the same at certain points in history, or most points in history. So that's also a good warning to students, or to anyone who reads Batman, that, this is a consequence. These are the people who come out unabashed. And so I think that's an important line. Like, you don't just learn what a good man does, like Bruce Wayne. You learn what a bad man does, like the Joker, who doesn't seem to care about heteronormativity or anything.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Times have changed. I have known others in the community who came out 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it happened. They lost their jobs, they lost their families, and it was more common than not for the very small percentage of people who could actually say, I'm going to live in my preferred gender. But typically they would lose their jobs and all the rest of it. The world is much more accepting now. But as you say, the Joker, he never cared about that. I think that's a really important point. There are stories where, and this is actually a fear for transgender people. Another reason I keep the secret identity is because some bad guy might use it against me. And that's exactly, I think, what you're talking about. Joker would absolutely be the bad guy representing society as a whole. Would you use it against you if you told the world?
Yeah, I mean, he's a threat, right? He can't be trusted, and part of that depends on the society, right? If we live in a society where nobody cares, everyone is accepting, then the Joker wouldn't use it against you, if the Joker existed. Yeah, exactly. But because the Joker understands the social conventions of the time, and he is, happy to go with them or against them, depending on what he does or what he wants to get, he would definitely, use that against somebody like Bruce Wayne, who, we were talking earlier about like the closet, and how the Batcave is to some extent sort of a closet, and that can represent different things to different people. But yeah, when the Joker gets in there, it's a complete violation of trust, and those are always scary plot lines if you're paying attention to Batman.
Yeah, and Chris mentions the Batcave, the Hangar of Solitude. Another very common trait, aspect of being transgender, is that we have to have a Batcave. I was fortunate for a long time that I actually had a little kind of a back room in a building. And that's where I could store my clothes and change. And it was very much what Batman does. Of course, it wasn't a cave. It wasn't technological. But it was a place where I could go to reconnect with Diana, just as Bruce Wayne, as he enters the Batcave, reconnects with Batman. It's where he literally changes his clothes to become Batman. It's where I would change my clothes to become Diana. It's where all my cool stuff is stored. The clothes, the jewelry, all the rest of it, or the trophies and the giant penny and the computers and the Batmobile. I was fortunate in that I had that, but every transgender person has something like it. It may just be a suitcase in the closet or in the attic. It may be a storage locker. It may be it takes all kinds of forms, but we all have to have that secret place to, in safety, become the other true self. And you mentioned in your book, you talk about how when the Batcave was violated by Bain or Hush, it was a huge violation, which it would be to somebody transgender if somebody stumbles across their stuff.
Yeah. What was that like before? I mean, obviously you're worried people come in and might do that, but yeah, I'm curious if you found any other sort of connections, or it doesn't even necessarily need to be connected to Batman, but I can imagine there are similarities, of course.
Well, we talked about that joy of first going out. I think that the whole thing with the costume is very important. Having the Batcave. Another thing that happens, of course, Batman doesn't have superpowers per se, although there have been discussions. There have been discussions. But Iron Man, he doesn't have superpowers until he puts on a suit. Green Lantern doesn't have superpowers until he puts on his ring. I was trying to articulate this earlier with Chris, because I definitely feel, and I think that most transgender people do, that when they become the other true self, there are, I want to say superpowers, but of course that's not it. But what after thinking about it a little bit, I think that what happens, at least with me, and I should have said this first thing, I do not speak for the transgender community. I can only speak for myself. I'm empowered to enjoy, I'm empowered to be more open. I'm empowered to say words like cute and lovely. I'm empowered to enjoy pretty things in a store just because they're pretty. I'm empowered to wear much better clothes. I'm empowered to be more open with my feelings, with people I first meet, with people that I know, with friends, with family. Empowerment, as there is empowerment as a male. I'm discovering the empowerment as a woman that maybe it's part of the social construct, maybe not, but it's very real. It's difficult to articulate what it is, but it's very real.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to think about too a little bit, is that it's real in the sense that, yeah, if you go out, you're treated a certain way. I mean, these are real things. You're a real person, no matter how you're acting or performing, right? But it's also constructed and fake in that sense, because it's not as if there was a law of gravity, right? These are so they're all social constructions. But I always think of Cornel West, who says, I can understand the construction of race and class and these things, but it doesn't help me get a cab in Harlem when I'm trying to hail one as a black man, because, cabbies don't necessarily, especially at the time he was writing, think about the construction of race, or even if they did, they still act in real ways, real material ways, right? And that's, I think, an important thing too. So it's not like there's, if we say that this is not real, or this is fake or performative, that's not to say that there aren't real, actual things happening, right? And, some of those things we have to worry about, like you were talking about, driving here a few hours at least, and worrying about how you might be treated and who might be out there and what threats might be there, which I would imagine, there are always threats in the world, but the threats that you have to face or think about now would be different, right?
They are. At this point, I'm very glad to say that I don't have I have not had, I should say. I've been fortunate that I have not had the threat of somebody I just say, and having some issues of that nature. And partly I think it's because, but I want to come back to this thing of gender as a social construct. And I think that's what I'm trying to say. when I hear that, okay, I'm going to go back to superheroes. In the books and in all the movies, there's always a scene, and it's not superhero movies, it's action movies. There's always this scene where the hero is gearing up. Batman is putting on the belt, he's putting on the cowl. Iron Man, it's all mechanical, but they show in great detail, putting on the pieces. Arnold Schwarzenegger, getting the bag with all the guns in it and putting the guns in and all the rest of it. They are, in those scenes, they're making that transition and constructing what is necessary for the performance.
Yeah.
Which I do every day. Every day when I get dressed, I kind of think in the back of my mind those scenes, because it's all these bits and pieces. It's the I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I'm constructing a gender just as every woman does, every man does. It's just that I'm much more aware of it.
Yeah.
Because it's a different construction than I had done for all those years before.
Yeah.
So I live that.
Yeah, I was thinking too of, Frederick Wortham was scared that people would read this and, live out a homosexual fantasy, right? That's what he was scared of at the time. And that led to all these, horrible movements, burning comics, among other things, right? But I think that, I was talking to Will Brooker about this, who wrote some great books on Batman. But there's this idea that, comics will expose you to the constructed nature of this. That's not how he phrases it, but I think they're both right in the sense that Wortham was scared for society that reading books would expose young men in particular to alternative lifestyles, right? And I think I say kind of the same thing. I'm just a lot happier about it. And I think that's something that I want people to get, I hope, from the book, is that, yeah, you are conscious of what you do every day, of putting on certain clothing, but also putting on a certain persona in a sense. And I mean, so am I, even if I don't come across as part of the queer community, right? I mean, I talk to my students about how I try to act more authoritative in class. I put on a blazer so I look a little bit more authoritative. I'm conscious of these things, but I think the risk is that if, why are we trying to hide these things? Like, why are we trying to make it not obvious that you and I and everyone else are putting on these roles? I think the whole, I think the scary part or the dangerous part is the whole idea that this could be natural, because no, it's not natural. The way that Wortham dressed was not natural, and the way that we continue to think of men and women in traditional quote unquote roles, it's not natural either. I think the threat to, I guess, conservatives who want to pursue this idea of a natural man and a natural woman. I think the threat of comics is that, it exposes that we're all putting on outfits, right? And if we have fun thinking about that, then, I say more power to us. They say, I don't know, that's the destruction of humanity or something. I'm not sure, but it's the same issue. It's just a different, I think, approach, right?
Yeah. I think that I may be taking a little bit of an issue, I'm not sure. But I do feel that the constructs that are, I don't want to say normal, most commonly in the world are kind of necessary for society to survive, or at least the society that we have built. Now, if we'd started out where everybody lives their true self all the time, we would have built a different society. But in the one that we have, if people start being too disruptive, and I won't get into politics, but if people start flailing around and destroying too many institutions and conventions, at some point, well, we're getting kind of off the subject, but I just want to say one thing. You mentioned Frederick Wortham. I actually grew up in that era. I want to say something about my mother. She would tell a story how her friends at the time would say, "How do you let your children read these horrible comic books?" And her response was, "As long as they're reading." That was her whole attitude. She never censored anything. And and that was in the '50s. But the comics that I was reading at the time, a lot of you will know what I mean when I say this, in the Silver Age, were very much the product of Wortham's book, and then Stanley and Marvel and all that. But those were, in those most formative years, that's what I was reading. And it was very formulaic, but it also was very, as I've said before, very instructive in which roles and how to work with those roles. Again, I'm kind of thinking this through as we talk. No, go ahead.
Well, no, I'm just thinking, I kind of think that, you know, I'm obviously glad, as you are, that your mother let you do that kind of stuff. I had parents as well who, you know, didn't try to stop me from reading books that I'm sure they would have sort of objected to in a sense, but also, you know, they were fine, especially, at least he's reading. And that kind of atmosphere, I think, is dangerous because it questions a lot of the foundational institutions and these kinds of things, right? As the Joker does, questioning a lot of institutions, regular, you know, traditional practices. I think the threat of the Joker often, and that's what I use in the book, is that, you know, he uses the UN against people. He uses the police and the state and the government in different ways against people. And he uses what I like, you know, as an example, is that he uses the courts and the judges. You know, he makes his own courtroom and he follows procedures and he does all these things. And we look at it and we say, like, that's ridiculous. That's not how things are supposed to go. But I think the scary part is that he's just doing it. Like, he's part of a traditional role and he's showing you how fake it all is. Fake in the sense that it's performative, right? There's no natural history of why we have the Supreme Court the way it looks, right? These are products that people have done, that people have put out, and that people are using to, in some senses, control or at least manipulate power, right? And so as soon as the Joker does it, that becomes obvious and that becomes very scary. So if we're reading these books, and that's the thing, I think the traditional threat with like homosexuality and gay culture or whatever was that you know, you get like the hypodermic needle, right? You get exposed to this thing, you'll become gay. So don't read this book. You know, hide these books, because as soon as your little Billy reads this book, he'll become gay. And I think that was the sort of threat. But as we've seen, I mean, that's not obviously what happens. But I think there is a threat that it will make you question these kinds of institutions, not necessarily destroy them all, but just question the legitimacy of it, which can be scary if you're trying to maintain holds on power.
You know, I've often wondered, Joker was never my favorite villain. And I've also often wondered why he was always the go-to villain. He was the one that has lasted all these years. He's the major villain.
Yeah.
He doesn't have any superpowers. He dresses funny. Why the Joker? And I'm thinking, could it be that at least part of his appeal is just what you're saying, is that it's a safe way to kind of destroy these institutions, but within the confines of a comic book, so we could see, oh, that's what that would look like without actually having to go and throw bombs. I wonder if that's part of his appeal is, there are a few people who go out and throw bombs, but lots and lots of people think there's a better way to do it. You know, I'm going to whatever, but they don't do it. But the Joker allows them to, as you're saying, think about doing it. Do you think?
Yeah. Well, the thing about the Joker that's fascinating to me, the more I think about him, is that a lot of people do love him. I mean, I'm repulsed by some things he does, like, you know, killing families, but I'm also enthralled by the way that he is the perfect villain compared to Batman's perfect hero, right? They fit so well together because and you know, the Joker always throws out these ideas to Batman, which upsets Batman usually, is that they're basically the same except they're on different sides, but they're doing the same thing. They're dressing strange, both of them. They're outside of the law, both of them. They're doing what they think sort of is right, I think the Joker does have a very clear understanding of the world and of social conventions. He just thinks to hell with it, whereas Batman thinks to a more or less extent they need to be upheld, at least in certain situations, right? But they're the same person. They're both conscious of all these performances that they're both doing, but Batman wants his, or Bruce Wayne in particular, wants his to look natural, and you can't be natural if you expose yourself as performing, right? Whereas the Joker, happy to say that it's a performance. Everything is a joke, in the same way that everything is a laugh, everything is a performance. And so, but he allows us to live through that too, but not necessarily to do it, So like, yeah, I'd love to, in some cases, cause mayhem, but I don't. But I love to see the Joker do it, and I'm also very sort of relieved when Batman fixes things. Mm-hmm. But he does allow people. There's this great petition I mentioned in the book called "Make Joker Gay Again" that I found online, and it was just this idea. As far as I can tell, it's a legit idea that the person is putting forward, that having the Joker be openly homosexual, openly queer representative is empowering, whereas he could easily have equally been out and a queer representative in the 40s, and that wouldn't have been seen at that time, I think, as empowering. But that's how things have changed. Even though we know he's a bad guy, he's still on kids' pajamas, and he's still adored by all these people as a bad guy, but he's a sort of loved bad guy, which shows you that these things are never so simple, and that's part of the whole thing.
Do you think that if the Joker had never been introduced, and we had all the other villains, Penguin, Riddler, and Mr. Freeze, all the rest of them, if Batman would have survived as a character?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean,
as important as you're saying Joker is to Batman being Batman,
well, yeah.
would there literally be a Batman if there had been no Joker?
Oh, I love that question. Yeah, because to me, at least in the book, it relates to the idea of would there be heterosexuals if there weren't homosexuals? And that's
you that's right. You do talk about go ahead.
Well, just exactly, like we think that of course there'd be Batman, right? Or of course there'd be straight people, but no, actually, if you didn't have bad guys, villains in the Batman world, Batman wouldn't need to exist, right?
But this particular villain.
Yeah, that's true. Well, to answer that, I think you need, if the Joker didn't exist, there wouldn't be all these contingencies that make Batman so clearly upholder of law because of this other guy who's doing more or less the same, but on the other side. I think you would have to have an equivalent, right? And we don't get sidetracked too much, but there's this long history of bad gay guys, right? Bad villains who are representing queer communities, because that's the historical narrative, right? If you're queer, you're criminal, and if you're criminal, you might likely be queer, and so there was this conflation of those two things. And so, I've seen there's a lot of characters who are sort of can be read as gay, but I think Batman wouldn't be Batman without the Joker, in the same sense, in this performative aspect, that heterosexuals wouldn't have existed, and they didn't exist until homosexuality was invented a couple centuries ago now, where people started coming up with medical terms, and then they became homosexual was a medical term that was diagnosed as a mental disorder or mental illness. Now it's not, but after that, that's when we started talking about heterosexuals as a quote unquote good thing or normal thing compared to this other, but the other had to be constructed. And so I guess technically, Batman came before the Joker, sort of.
A year?
Yeah, not by very much at all, but yeah, I don't think that Batman would have become the hero that he is. The mythos would have been around if we didn't have the Joker. Or, if we had the Joker or a different character than the Joker, we would have had a different Batman than the Batman. But
that's what,
you need those two things in the same, and that's what's going on. You need that idea of, straight as natural to have queer as unnatural. And you actually, both of them need each other. And that's why if you just say everything is a performance, then it breaks down this dichotomy, which I love. But I can also see how people who don't like that are very scared of these kinds of conversations.
Up until right now, I was wondering about the subtitle of your book, Contested Sexuality. And I think I see what that means now. Because, yeah, the need for the other to be oneself. And because their interactions implied in earlier years, much more overt now, have always had these kind of sexual overtones in one way or another. And I think that, I don't know if that's what you meant by the subtitle, but I think that makes sense in terms of the subtitle of your book.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I try to make it, as I think a lot of people do, open to interpretation. I would never say that this is the correct interpretation of my book title, but I personally love now when I read Batman and when I think through this lens, which, sometimes I don't always think through queer theory lens when I'm reading a comic or whatever, but I love it when the Joker calls out Batman like he does in White Knight and says, we're basically a couple. We're fighting. We're going to make up. You need me. I need you. And that's always so threatening to Batman if you think of him as a heteronormative, macho guy. That's such a threat. But if you think of it as an opportunity, then it's not. But that's the whole contest of sexuality, right? If you say effectively, I'm a straight macho guy, which you don't need to because that's natural, then if somebody says, well, actually, you're not a straight macho guy, look, let's have some fun with that, or you're performing just like I'm performing, then that's a threat because that whole facade gets torn down, right? Which is what the Joker's always doing. And so if you read that as a sort of meta-narrative of how society, what is there to be scared of about the trans community, about the gay community, about all these quote unquote others, right? It's that they question the whole idea of the normal community, which, gets to go unnoticed until you realize from whatever experience, or for me, reading queer theory, reading comic books and both, that, none of that stuff is normal. They're all part of this continuum, but, for a long time, the norms had the monopoly on everything. But as soon as you show like, no, actually there's other options, there's other things, and you're pretending this too, right? It's very scary to people who don't think they're pretending.
I have to think maybe there's another congruence here. As you say, Joker, would you say, knows that he's not pretending?
Yeah, I would say Joker embraces his performance, and I would call it, he doesn't necessarily, but I would call it a queer performance.
Where Batman is trying to be more as normal as you can be in a bat suit.
Yeah.
But in the transgender world, I'll just, again, my own example, my whole goal was always to just be a real person in the real world. But there are, as we know, a lot of people who pursue being a drag queen, and maybe that's the difference. I'm more like a Batman, where I don't know where I'm going with that. Help me out here.
Well, Batman and Bruce Wayne, if I follow you, Batman and Bruce Wayne are like obviously the same person on some level, but they're also a sort of binary, right? You're either Batman or Bruce Wayne, and it goes back and forth. And I think that's one way to think of gender and sexuality, but it's not the only way, right? I don't think there's necessarily an equivalent when you talk about the closet or the idea of putting on a costume. I don't think that that's necessarily a one-to-one, or at least the way I read queer theory is that it doesn't have to follow. It doesn't have to follow a one-to-one where, okay, now you're Bruce Wayne, now you're Batman. You can always, play around with it. I think, but Batman tries very hard. Bruce Wayne and Batman try very hard to say, no, now I'm 100% Bruce Wayne, now I'm 100% Batman. The Joker and others are more fluid, I think. And so it's on some level maybe a preference. Like if you wanted to be a drag queen who's 100% this person 10% of the time, that would be one option. Or if you are Diana, if you see Diana 100% of the time, it's a different option.
Yeah. Well, that brings up some really good points, which I have forgotten. I'm sorry.
No, don't worry.
I think the difference is when Batman is Batman, he's still bringing all of Bruce with him. Everything that Bruce Wayne, every minute of his existence, it's still there. And vice versa. When he's Bruce Wayne, he may not be thinking, oh, next time I'm Batman, I'm going to whatever. Which is the same before I was living full time, I think is what you were saying. When I would go out as Diana, there was still a piece of me thinking, think about paying the bills and the car, what are we going to do with the car, and Christmas presents, and all the stuff of that other self, and vice versa. So maybe that makes me more like the Joker, because Joker's not thinking about an alternate true self. He's just thinking about the now me. So maybe I'm the Joker. Oh no.
I think part of the appeal of the Joker and Batman is that none of us can live up to Batman, right? I think in a similar way, none of us can live up to like the heteronormative ideal man. Like, I've never seen it. I've definitely never been it. It's an unrealistic expectation, and it's full of traps, I think. But also, none of us are fully Joker, I hope, but we all have a little bit of Joker in us, which, maybe just means that we all have a little bit of trickster in us, because I think the Joker goes back to an earlier, as many people have said, goes back to an earlier trickster mythology persona, right? A gender fluid person, fluid in terms of in and out of the law, right? He's a transgressor of so many boundaries, and the trickster has done that, the Joker does that. But I think we all love the trickster and we all love the Joker because, as all these people are pretending certain things, the Joker will point and laugh and say, you're pretending. And he'll do it for the people who try hardest to pretend that they're not pretending, right? So I think of, in the book at least, the courts and the judges who are supposed to be 100% objective, or the police who are supposed to be 100% law-abiding politicians, of course. He will point and laugh at them and say, you are pretending, and he'll call them on it, right? It's very much the Emperor's New Clothes. I think the Joker is the little kid who points and says, haha, you're naked, while everyone else, doesn't want to acknowledge it.
And then kill you.
Yeah. Well, that's where the connection might end, I hope.
Yeah. Who knows? Something else that we talked about last night, Chris, was I think this is just something to point out. I don't even know if it's a thesis, but I think it's interesting that the more widespread acceptance of the superhero as a legitimate element of not just popular culture, but culture, has really happened like more or less in the last 10 years. Same with transgender people and being transgender. My transition was very easy. I'm retired, but I have a part-time job, and the organization was very supportive. My family was very supportive. Everybody's been very supportive. Where 15, 20 years ago, I know, I don't think, but I know, would not have nearly that level of support. And I think it's the same with the comics, that particularly with the blockbuster movies, it's just more respectable, legitimate to think about, to have scholarly treatments like yours of comic books.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say one for one, or this caused one and that caused another. I think it's just an interesting, gigantic coincidence. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I think like we were saying earlier when we were talking, it's probably not a coincidence in the sense that like two random things happen, right? There is some kind of connection.
Something, yeah.
But yeah, you can't say that comics came so people became more accepting of the queer community or vice versa. Yeah. But I think that's such a good point, is that I think, there were sort of trickles of it. I remember there was a kind of bad Punisher in the 80s movie, like a poorly made movie, but something I really liked as a kid. And And, I think Spider-Man, the first with Tobey Maguire, was really the breakthrough in terms of popularity of comic books becoming movies. And that's continued, and it hasn't slowed down. That's one of the things I've been interested in. I've been speaking to people who study comics, for the podcast, and a number of them have just commented about how a lot of trends were, they came and went, right? In terms of movies and all these areas. But the genre, if you want to call it that, or the idea of putting movies together with superheroes, there are technical reasons, right? Because of the special effects possibilities. But I think we all want to be superheroes to an extent, but I think we also all want to sort of we all want to put on an outfit, and we all want to play, and we all want to have those kinds of moments. Like, I'm to an extent, I'm jealous of you for saying that, you felt like Spider-Man when you went out there because it was, free, and you felt like you had a superpower. And I think, everyone wants that. And so I think the more that we can kind of just, have fun and accept that people can become temporarily perhaps superheroes, but they can also be more playful with and less constricted with their gender and sexual performance of who they are, I think that's really empowering. And I think those two things do go together in a sense.
Yeah. It's interesting that you were talking earlier about the gay person as the villain in movies. And you can kind of follow that through the, if a man wore a dress in a movie, he was either so silly as to be cast aside, or a killer, Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, Dressed to Kill, Psycho. But think the Superman TV series. He was just Superman, and then he was Clark Kent, and there wasn't a lot of nuance there. Even Christopher Reeves, which I loved his performance, he was still, it was getting there. But now, the treatment of the superhero as a person, and they're different people. Steve Rogers has a different life than Tony Stark. They also happen to be Captain America and Tony Stark, Iron Man. That has changed to become more real. Same with the depiction of the transgender. You think Orange is the New Black, or the character in the Dallas Buyers Club. RuPaul has a limited series on Netflix. So there's something in the water we're drinking that has made these two streams of, I don't want to say popular culture, of culture, not intermingling, but definitely on strikingly similar paths.
Yeah, I totally, especially when you say that and use those examples, I see exactly what you mean. And I think these characters have been around long enough that, I'm very happy. People are not simply using them as a quick, this is this. So I think, semiotically, people use these quick images. So here's a cross-dresser. So here's the bad guy, right?
Here's the killer.
That's all you need to know.
Cross-dresser with an axe.
Yeah. And so that was a simple technique, I guess. So again, we'll show you someone who's clearly queer. They're probably the criminal too. And that was easy. But now I think we've seen enough of that we don't accept it, I hope. I think most of us have grown sort of tired of those stereotypes, and we understand that they're stereotypes because they've existed now for a while. I think there may be developing stereotypes today that we don't see because they're sort of new.
That's what I was going to say. There's probably new,
they're becoming stereotypes.
Maybe the stereotype is, the prostitute with a heart of gold, the transgender with a heart of gold. Now that's the stereotype. Is that becoming the stereotype? That
maybe in 10 years we'll be tired of that or something.
And as I said, I don't speak for the transgender community. I don't pretend to, but everybody in the transgender community is a person with all of the contradictions, problems, ups and downs, good and bad of any given group of people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, which seems so obvious that it shouldn't need to be stated, but because of, the history of the way that different groups in society have been represented, yeah, you kind of need to say that. But as you said earlier, it's not as needed as it was, decades ago. It's more acceptable. It's more I would hope society in general is more welcoming. And, yeah, I love that. I think that after you said that, I was thinking there are certain sort of trailblazers that we wouldn't have this more acceptance without them, but they were trailblazers because they did things they came out in ways and in powerful, sometimes very mediated pop culture ways, but they pushed the boundary of questioning things, and now we don't necessarily have to question it as much. And so that's, I think, a big in comics, right? Early comics were seen as really poorly done, whatever. And then because of those early trailblazers, we now have a general acceptance of comics, right? As a medium to study, as a medium to read. And I think in a similar way, obviously there are some differences, but queer culture and the different streams of queer culture have, pushed to the point where in most cases, I hope, they don't have to, say like, hey, I'm a human being. Instead, it's acceptable now. But that came through a lot of pushing in a somewhat similar way that, acceptance of comics. I don't want to equate them, but people push for comics to be accepted, and now the push isn't as necessary because the conversation has gotten a lot more nuanced. I think, in some ways that's happened with different communities, like the trans community.
Definitely. Caitlyn Jenner was not a trailblazer in the sense you're talking about. That would have to be Christine Jorgensen back in the first transsexual in the 50s. And there are some others. But it was when Caitlyn, it felt like, as another transgender person, it felt like that was the moment where there was a change in the air. Where if Bruce Jenner can do this, and the media accepts it so wholeheartedly, embraces it, not just say, oh, well, okay, that's fine, but embraces it, it almost feels like that was not she's not a trailblazer, but it does feel like a bit of a watershed.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I love how we can think critically about that moment now, because it's not the one and only. We can think
critically about it. That's yes.
Yeah, because we can have a nuanced conversation. We can say, you know what? She's human. And so it's not that she is some deity to be worshipped now, but also she's not some villain to be vilified immediately. There are nuances, right? And I hope that we're moving in that direction more and more, where yeah, we can talk about the nuances of Batman, because, he's been around for so long that at first there was just like one or two things to understand. But now we can think about, like you said, the costume, like we can spend time thinking about what does it mean that this was added or subtracted from the narrative. And those are, a more fine-grained reading of that. And I think we can do more and more of that, because there is more and more, although obviously it's not where I think any of us would like it to be in terms of acceptance, but I think there's more and more nuance and acceptance and possibility, right? You don't have to be the one trans person. You can hopefully, and it gets bigger and bigger, choose kind of what representation better fits you. And I think that's, comic book heroes have done that. People can say I'm more Spider-Man or Batman or whatever, and it's become more and more. There's still lots of room for representation, but I think the more representation we get, as you said, the more it just becomes, there's more possibility. It just keeps opening up.
Yeah, there's a lot more possibility. Has been so much experimentation with the comic book trope, particularly with, even with the big ones. DC and Marvel have done some pretty outrageous things. But the others, the indies, the Image and all of them, and they've taken these, we might have, these detailed conversations about the serif in Superman's shield, but the bottom of that argument is that Superman has to wear the shield. He has to have the shield. If he doesn't, he's not Superman. It kind of makes me think of that little Easter egg in, I think it was the first X-Men movie, where they were flying to the mission, and they were all wearing their combat suits. And Wolverine said, "Why are we wearing these suits?" And Cyclops says, "What'd you want? Yellow spandex?" And of course, every fanboy in the theater just howled at that, because they were making the point that that yellow spandex suit in the comics is critical to Logan becoming Wolverine, but it doesn't work in the movies. So what do? We find it's still a costume. It's one that works visually, but but he's making the point, yes, we have to put on these suits before we go and be the X-Men. Other than that, we're still Scott Summers and Logan.
Yeah.
We put on the suit, whether it's yellow spandex or black leather. Now we're Cyclops and Wolverine, but not before. So there's always that underlying, these kind of foundational tropes, I keep using that word, are so critical to both communities.
Yeah, but we can think in nuanced ways about it, right? We can.
Yes, and we can now. Because they're so well established.
Exactly.
Because we can't have an Easter egg like that in the movie.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I mean, on just a basic level, I think we're all doing that. And as soon as we start to kind of more embrace it than fear it, especially, in mainstream pop culture, which I think has already started to an extent. But I think for a lot of people, there's still this idea that, you put on your costume, this is just who I am, right? I'm normal. You are doing something special or abnormal.
That's a really good point.
And we're all putting on some kind of costume no matter what. And I think it allows us to see each other better, everyone, when we kind of acknowledge that. Yeah,
I see what you're wearing now. And if you wore what you're wearing now to your class or to a conference with your supervisor or to a conference, be fine. If you wore to a demolition derby, you'd really stand out. And why is that? It's still it's a pants, a shirt, and a jacket. But, that's the point, isn't it? It's a pants, shirt, and jacket, just like it's a costume or not, a superhero costume or not. But it's the nuances of what the pants, shirt, and jacket you're wearing, as opposed to the pants, shirt, and jacket that, a crowd at a demolition derby might be wearing.
Yeah,
which makes all the difference.
Yeah.
And so those nuances you're talking about really are critical, aren't they?
Yeah, and the more we can acknowledge that and think about it, I think the cooler, more interesting, there's more potential in that conversation. But just as an aside, it's funny, one of the students was talking to my partner who teaches at the same school and said, do you know Chris? You gotta talk to him or get a form signed or something. And the student didn't know who I was. So the other student apparently was just like, the guy in skinny jeans and a blazer, you'll find him. And so that's apparently my costume, even though
there's your costume.
Yeah. I explained to them, these are not skinny jeans. These are regular jeans that look skinny compared to the baggy jeans that the students wear. But
because that's normal, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I mean, whatever stands out is not the norm, and whatever doesn't stand out is the norm in whatever setting we're talking about. But I think comics help us, at least the argument I make is that they help us realize that, those are costumes too. They seem like they fit better.
And you touch on these kind of issues, I think, in your book, because again, it comes down to, now we've gone a little bit different direction, but it still comes down to that performative nature. That's, I think, is, I may be wrong, but it feels like that's the sort of the core of your book, and everything else in your book builds from that. Maybe that's just because that's what what hit me so strongly. But when you talk about the different spaces, for example, that they inhabit, and the difference between the Batcave and the Hacienda. Two totally different environments, but why? There's still a place to go and rest up and have your stuff. They could be identical warehouses, on different sides of the street. But no, Batman has to have the Batcave. Joker has to have the Hacienda. The because even in those environments, they're creating the environment that supports the performance, or the performance creates the environment.
There's no getting out of this.
I don't know. Oh, this is the first time I've ever been able to use this word. It becomes recursive.
Yeah.
Doesn't it? First time I've been able to use that word appropriately. It does become recursive.
Yeah, well, I think it's both scary and invigorating to think that, like, there's no before. And, like I said, Judith Butler and others make the same argument, really, is that it's not like we're copying something. I mean, we are, but there's no original that we go back to. You can't say like, okay, well, Batman exists, but Batman only exists because Dick Tracy existed, or because the Phantom existed, or any of the precursors, right?
Superman, Doc Savage.
Yeah. It's true that Doc Savage, others influenced Batman and other comics, and Batman has influenced other people, as I mentioned, but it's not like there's some original man or woman or gender or sexuality that is like, oh yeah, that's the real one, the starting, and then we're all going from that. It's no, we've made it up as we went along. And yeah, maybe you have an image of somebody that you want to be like, and I'm sure I do too, some conscious, some unconscious, but they did too, right? And there's the iterative process where it recursively goes back and back and back.
Yeah.
I mean, we could probably talk for another few days.
Well, it's interesting that these two streams of culture, I think we may be the first ones to and I just have to say, there may be only two people, maybe not in the world, but we may be the only two people that would have come up with this, in a sense, because of your deep academic background and your love of the comics, and my lifetime awareness of being transgendered and now living full time, and my love of the comics. I think it's just that started out with the internet installer saying, "Oh, my son would love this." Yeah,
I am so happy that I'm so happy. So these are like coincidences, but they're also. I don't want to say, I think of like, there's this Marxist term, overdetermined, right? And to me, what I understand, the way Raymond Williams explains it, is sort of that it wasn't just this one thing that happened, right? It was this and this and this. And so if it wasn't this other thing would have pushed you in that direction. And so, yeah, I think, you and I met through this wonderful happenstance. But I like to think that, maybe we would have met at a comic convention or something else, right? Like, I think because of my interest, I was more attuned to certain questions, right? And I think same with you. And I think that we are a great, unique bringing together of that, a confluence of those ideas and questions that we've been thinking about, even though we didn't know it at the time. But I hope that there are a bunch of other people out there having those same moments of connection through Batman or through Superman or anything, really. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to pursuing these discussions with you and seeing where it ends up, because just in this conversation, there have been light bulbs, connections made that I hadn't thought about before. I love that. I do too. That's I kind of had it rehearsed what I was going to say, and I kind of thought, yeah, but I wonder what'll happen just from talking. And here it is. And yes, that's just been wonderful. And again, it's this book that. Well, I want to recommend it to everybody, of course, because it has spoken so strongly to me and has, again, no pun intended, engendered kind of a whole new area of discussion, at least, research possibly. Yeah. We'll see where it goes. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for the book and for all your work with the collection. I know that I have to say that Chris hasn't really talked about this, but he has implied that getting the college to accept that collection was not a smooth glide path.
I'll just leave it at that because that's really all I know.
Thank you.
But I do appreciate that. And really the way the college has handled and curated and secured these books, which are untellably important to me. It just means so much to me.
Oh, we appreciate it, and more people are going to benefit from that.
I hope so. I'm really looking forward to. Unfortunately, because of the COVID, we can't. The opportunity for research, I guess, is kind of come to an end or a halt. But when it does, it'll be so exciting to see what comes out of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.